You think you know someone after 23 years, but then they show you just how little you matter. The words hit harder than anything David had ever heard, and they came from the last person he'd ever expect, his wife, Samantha. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the courtroom's air conditioner, a harsh contrast to the storm raging in David's chest. This wasn't just another divorce case. This was a battle for everything he had built. Samantha sat across from him, her eyes cold, her posture straight as an arrow, but it wasn't her looks that cut him to the core. It was the audacity. She had claimed half of everything. His business, his family's ranch, even the land his grandfather had worked until his last breath. $8.5 million. The number echoed in David's mind like a cruel joke. His hands tightened around the papers in front of him as the judge looked on, waiting for the next move. This was supposed to be a simple divorce. A little division of assets, some uncomfortable talks, maybe even a few tears. Instead, it had turned into a war, one David never expected to fight. He had always thought that the bond they shared, built over decades of marriage, would be enough to hold them together. But Samantha had proven him wrong. She had already calculated every move, taken the steps to secure her share, and now, with one final blow, she had asked for everything. But David wasn't going down without a fight. He had a secret of his own, one Samantha didn't see coming. As the judge called for a brief recess, David's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. He wasn't just some mechanic anymore. He wasn't just the guy who built everything with his hands. He had a card to play, a card that would turn the entire case on its head. Samantha thought she had won, but David had one document that would change everything. He didn't have to say a word. The evidence was undeniable. It was time to reveal the truth. David sat in the courtroom, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to keep his composure. He could feel the weight of the entire room on his shoulders, the pressure of a life built from the ground up hanging in the balance. Samantha, on the other hand, looked perfectly composed. Her glossy black hair framed her face like a well-prepared mask, and her sharp, tailored suit screamed confidence, something she hadn't shown him in years. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. David could hear the faint echo of the gavel as the judge called for a short break, but to David, time seemed to stand still. He could feel his heart beating louder in his chest as he mentally prepared for the next phase of the trial. Samantha had played her cards well. She had made her case. She had painted him as the fool, the one who had no idea what was going on behind his back, the one who had spent too many nights away working to notice his own marriage falling apart. But she was wrong. David knew everything now. He could feel the anger bubbling up, not at her claim for money, but at the betrayal she had put him through. The same woman who had once promised to stand by his side, through thick and thin, was now sitting across from him, trying to take it all, everything he had worked for, everything they had built together. He leaned back in his chair, breathing slowly, forcing himself to focus. He had to keep calm. His plan was simple: wait for the right moment, then strike. Samantha had underestimated him. He wasn't just the man she had married. He was much more than that now. The document he held in his hand was his trump card, and he knew it. It was a document she never expected him to find. A document that, if shown at the right moment, would shatter her entire argument. David had spent hours combing through old files, looking for anything that could protect him. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the principle, about the respect he had lost, about the man he had become. The paper he held was proof of ownership, of everything she thought she had a claim to. It was a legal document, a signed agreement that placed full ownership of the ranch and all its assets squarely in his name. Samantha had thought she could pull this off, that her manipulation in the marriage would be enough to sway the judge. But David had done his homework, and he wasn't going to let her walk away with everything. He glanced at his lawyer, who gave him a subtle nod. It was time. David stood up slowly, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to submit this document as evidence." The room fell silent as David handed the document to his attorney, who passed it on to the judge. Samantha's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly masked it with a smirk. David could see through it. She knew what was coming. The judge took the paper and examined it carefully, the silence in the room growing thicker with each passing second. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge looked up. "This document, it appears to be signed by both parties. and it shows that the ranch is solely under Mr. Carter's name. It seems that Mrs. Carter did not have a legal claim to these assets. The words hit Samantha like a punch to the gut. Her face drained of color as the truth settled in. David could feel a surge of relief, but he didn't let it show. He had won. Not just the case, but his dignity, his respect, and his future. Samantha opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. She was speechless. David knew this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was back in control. The game had changed. Samantha had underestimated him, and now there was no turning back. David sat back down in his chair, trying to suppress the relief that was slowly building inside him. The courtroom was still as the judge flipped through the pages of the document David had just presented. He could feel Samantha's glare from across the room, a mixture of disbelief and frustration in her eyes. It was almost satisfying to see her like this, after everything she had put him through. He had been the one humiliated, the one doubted, and now, for the first time, he was the one holding the power. The judge cleared his throat and looked up from the document. It seems there has been some miscommunication regarding the ownership of these assets, the judge said. Mrs. Carter, it appears the ranch and all related property are indeed in Mr. Carter's name. You have no legal claim here. Samantha's face turned crimson. The smug expression she had worn earlier had vanished, replaced by a look of pure panic. David didn't speak, but he could feel her eyes boring into him, her silent accusations hanging in the air. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. The weight of the truth was too much. For years, she had played the role of the dutiful wife, the perfect partner who always had a plan and always knew how to get what she wanted. But now, her facade was crumbling. David felt a quiet satisfaction in that. For the first time in months, he could breathe. The fight wasn't over, but this was a major victory. He had outsmarted her. He had kept his calm when she expected him to crack. The truth was now on his side, and he wasn't about to let her take anything from him. The judge nodded toward David's lawyer. It seems Mr. Carter is entitled to keep the ranch and the assets. Mrs. Carter's claims are invalid. David's lawyer, who had been quiet up until now, gave him a reassuring smile. David didn't return the smile. This wasn't over. He knew there was more to come. There would be battles ahead, but for now, he had won this round. Samantha was still trying to process what had just happened. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. She looked at her attorney, then back at the judge. It was clear she hadn't expected this turn of events. She had thought she was untouchable, that her carefully crafted story would be enough to secure her a large portion of David's wealth. But now, with the truth laid bare, there was nothing she could do. David stood up and walked toward the door, his heart steady, his mind focused. He had fought for this moment, and it was finally here. He didn't look back as he left the courtroom. There was no need to. The battle was far from over, but David knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her win again. David sat alone in his car, parked just outside the courthouse, the weight of the day settling in his chest. The air outside was still warm, the kind of late afternoon heat that lingered in the air long after the sun had begun to dip. He had won in court, but the victory felt hollow. He had spent so many years working for the ranch, for his family, but it was never enough. He thought of his grandfather, the man who had built the ranch from nothing. The land, the animals, the equipment, it was all a legacy now, and Samantha had been ready to tear it apart. She thought she could take it all, just like she had taken everything else. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. Not ever again. He thought of the moment when he handed the document to the judge. It was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he knew he could turn the tide. It wasn't just about the money or the land. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't the weak man Samantha thought he was. He wasn't just some mechanic who worked long hours and came home to a wife who didn't appreciate him. He was a man who had built something with his own hands. He had earned every inch of the ranch, every dollar in his account, every quiet moment he had spent watching the sun set over the fields. And Samantha had taken that for granted. He couldn't help but feel a little bitter. After everything they had been through together, after all the years they had spent building a life, she had thrown it all away for something that wasn't real. But David wasn't going to let that be the end of his story. He had more to prove, and it wasn't just to Samantha. It was to himself. As he started the engine and pulled away from the courthouse, his mind raced. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He knew there were still challenges ahead. Samantha wasn't going to give up that easily, but he had something now that she didn't. He had the truth, and that was a weapon he wasn't going to let go of. He drove through the quiet streets, the familiar landmarks of his small town blurring by. It was strange, he thought, how life could feel so familiar, so comforting, yet everything could change in an instant. He wondered how he had missed the signs for so long. How had he not seen what was happening in his marriage? The late nights, the distance, the constant excuses. Samantha had always been good at pretending, but David had always been good at seeing through the facade. He had ignored the signs because he had wanted to believe that things were fine. But now, there was no going back. He couldn't unsee what had been done. He couldn't forget the betrayal, and that made the victory feel a little sweeter. He turned onto the familiar dirt road that led to the ranch, the place that had been his sanctuary for so many years. It was quiet now, with only the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant lowing of cattle. He pulled up to the house, stopping just outside the front door. For a moment, he sat there, taking in the stillness. The house was empty, just as it had been for the past few months. Samantha had left, taking only what she needed, leaving behind a trail of broken promises. David wasn't sure what he was supposed to do now. His life had been turned upside down, and he had no idea what the future held. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her take everything from him. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, his footsteps steady and sure. He had won the battle, but there was still work to do. He had a life to rebuild, and this time, it was going to be on his terms. David stood in the doorway, staring at the ranch he had spent so many years building. The house that had once felt like a home, filled with laughter and promises, now stood empty. The silence that enveloped him was deafening, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of loss, of a life that had been shattered by betrayal. Samantha was gone, taking with her the pieces of a life they had once shared. The ranch was still his, but without her, it felt like something was missing. He had fought for this, for everything he had worked for, but the victory felt incomplete. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking just beyond his reach. As he stepped into the house, the familiar creak of the wooden floors beneath his boots reminded him of all the nights spent here, nights that had seemed so normal, so full of promise. He had believed in them, in the life they had built together, but now he knew. It had all been an illusion. Samantha had made her choice, and in doing so, she had exposed the truth that had been hiding beneath the surface for years. David walked over to the fireplace, where the faint scent of old wood still lingered. He had always been a man of simple pleasures. A hard day's work, a warm meal, and the quiet comfort of home. But now, that sense of peace had been shattered. He wasn't sure what came next. He didn't know what his future would look like without Samantha by his side, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her take everything from him. Not again. The thought of her moving on, taking what was his, still stung. But David wasn't the same man he had been when he first walked into that courtroom. He had changed. He had learned to fight for what he had, to stand up for himself when it mattered. And now, he was ready for whatever came next. He turned away from the fireplace, his gaze falling on the desk in the corner of the room. It was cluttered with papers, reminders of the work that still needed to be done. There was no time to dwell on the past. The ranch needed him. His future needed him. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was in control. As he sat down at the desk, David pulled out the legal documents that had turned the tide in his favor. He had won the battle in court, but the war wasn't over. He still had to navigate the maze of the divorce settlement, the business dealings, and the legacy of the ranch. He wasn't just fighting for his land. He was fighting for his dignity, for his future. And he wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, take that from him. The phone rang, breaking the silence of the room. David reached for it, his heart pounding slightly as he wondered who could be calling. It was his lawyer. He could already hear the urgency in the voice on the other end of the line. "David, we need to talk about the next steps," his lawyer said. "The settlement offer from Samantha's side is coming in, and there's a chance we can turn this in our favor once again." David listened carefully, his mind already working through the next steps. There was no time to waste. This was his moment, the moment where everything he had worked for, everything he had fought for, could slip through his fingers if he wasn't careful. But David wasn't afraid. He was ready. After the call ended, David sat in the chair for a moment, staring out the window at the vast expanse of land in front of him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields, and he felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had been through the storm. He had faced the betrayal, the lies, and the loss. But he had come out stronger on the other side. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, David felt like he was in control of his own destiny. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't going to let the past define him. He was going to make sure that the future he built was his own. David stood up, walked to the door, and stepped outside. The ranch was still his, and he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. David sat in his office, staring at the settlement papers his lawyer had just dropped off. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It wasn't just about the money or the land or even the divorce. This was about proving that he had more to offer than Samantha had ever seen. For years, he had lived under her shadow, always the one working in the background, always the one sacrificing his time, his energy, his dreams for the sake of their family. But now, as he looked at these papers, something clicked inside him. He wasn't going to let her take anything else from him. He wasn't going to let her rewrite the story of their life together. He had earned every inch of what he had built, and no one, especially not Samantha, was going to take that away. The settlement offer was generous, but it wasn't enough. Samantha wanted to walk away with a huge chunk of the ranch, the business, and a considerable amount of money. But David had worked too hard for too long to let it go that easily. He wasn't a man who gave up, especially not now. The thought of her strolling away with everything he had built made his blood boil, but he knew better than to act impulsively. The last few months had taught him a lot about patience and strategy. He was ready to fight, but he had to do it on his terms. He picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer. "We need to go over this offer again," he said. "I'm not settling for less than what's fair. I've worked too hard for this. I'm not walking away empty-handed, and I'm not letting her dictate the terms anymore." His lawyer's voice came through the phone, calm but serious. "David, I understand. Let's review the documents and see if we can negotiate a better deal. You have the upper hand now. We'll make sure you don't lose what's rightfully yours." David sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of control that had been missing for far too long. He wasn't just reacting to what Samantha had done anymore. He was taking charge of his own future. He had spent years letting her make the decisions, but now he was calling the shots. This was his life, his legacy, and he wasn't going to let her walk away with it. As he hung up the phone, a sense of calm washed over him. He wasn't sure how long this fight would last, but he knew one thing. He was going to win. He had worked for every piece of the ranch, every dollar in the bank, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. Not Samantha. Not anyone. He stood up from his desk, walked to the window, and looked out over the land that had been his grandfather's, that had been his father's, and now was his. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields, and for the first time in a long while, David felt at peace. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about who he was and what he had built. And no one, especially not Samantha, was going to take that away from him. David sat in his office the next day, looking over the final settlement offer. It was nearly the same as the last one. Samantha's legal team had been relentless, pushing for more than what was fair. They had tried to wear him down, but David wasn't going to give in. He had come too far to back down now. His lawyer had told him this was the final offer before they headed into mediation, and David had a choice to make. He could either accept what they were offering and walk away with the ranch and some cash, or he could keep fighting and risk it all. David's fingers tapped against the desk as he mulled it over. He wasn't going to be a fool. The deal still wasn't right, but he couldn't just let this drag on forever. Every time he thought of Samantha, sitting in the courtroom with that smug look on her face, he remembered how she had always gotten what she wanted. It had been that way from the start. She had made him believe that their marriage was built on respect, on love, but now he knew the truth. It had been built on manipulation. She had always thought she could control everything, including him, but not anymore. David wasn't the same man who had stood by silently while she made all the decisions. He had learned to stand up for himself. He had learned to fight back. The phone rang, and David picked it up, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his lawyer. "David, we've reviewed their latest offer. I'm not happy with the terms, but there's something we can do. We can push for more, but it's going to get ugly. The longer this drags on, the more it'll cost you, and there's no guarantee you'll get everything you want. It's your call." David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He had been through so much already. He had fought so hard for the ranch, for everything he had built. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect. It was about showing Samantha that she couldn't walk all over him anymore. He had to make a decision. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We're not backing down. I'm not accepting anything less than what's fair." His lawyer seemed to hesitate for a moment before responding. "All right, David. But you need to be prepared. This is going to get messy." "Are you sure?" David's jaw clenched as he stared at the papers in front of him. "I'm sure. Let's take it to mediation." Hanging up the phone, David felt a surge of energy. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully his. Samantha thought she had won. She thought she had control. But she didn't know David. She didn't know the man he had become. The man who had been pushed to the edge but refused to back down. The man who was finally ready to take back his life. He wasn't going to let her tear apart everything he had built. He had earned it, and he was going to keep it. David stood up and walked over to the window, looking out over the land that was still his. The fields stretched out in front of him, and he could see the ranch in the distance, standing tall and proud. It was his, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. Not Samantha. Not anyone. He had fought for this, and he was going to finish this fight on his terms. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of control. He was ready for whatever came next. David walked into the mediation room, his lawyer by his side. The room was quiet, too quiet for his liking. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper, the kind of place where things were decided in hushed tones and sharp words. He had been through a lot over the past few months, but this moment felt different. It felt like the calm before the storm. Samantha was already seated at the table, her lawyer beside her. She didn't look surprised to see him. She never did. Her eyes met his, cold and calculating. It was the look of a woman who thought she had already won. David had seen that look before, but this time, it didn't faze him. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. The mediator, a middle-aged man with graying hair and glasses perched on the tip of his nose, looked from Samantha to David. "Let's get started," he said, his voice measured but firm. He handed each of them a stack of papers, detailing the terms of the settlement. The deal on the table was the same as before. Samantha would walk away with a hefty sum, and David would retain the ranch. But there was a catch. The ranch was the heart of the matter, and it wasn't just about land. It was about legacy. It was about everything David had worked for. Samantha had tried to break him, to strip away everything he had built. She had thought she could tear it all down with a few legal maneuvers and a smile. But David wasn't going to let her. The mediator cleared his throat, signaling that the session was beginning. "Let's begin by discussing the terms," he said. Samantha's lawyer spoke first, his tone smooth and professional. "We're here to finalize the terms of the divorce and the asset division," he began. "Mrs. Carter is entitled to her fair share of the marital assets, including 50% of the ranch's value, which is valued at approximately $8.5 million. We've already agreed to a lump sum settlement that would cover this amount, plus some additional funds." Samantha leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. She looked over at David with a smirk, as if she already knew how this would play out. David's heart beat steadily, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not accepting this," he said, his voice steady, calm, but firm. Samantha's smirk faded, just for a moment, but it was enough. The mediator glanced between them. "Mr. Carter, this is a very reasonable offer," he said. "Why don't you take a moment to reconsider?" David shook his head. "This isn't reasonable. I've worked my entire life for that ranch. It's not just property, it's my legacy. It's my grandfather's legacy. I won't just hand it over because it's convenient for her." Samantha's lawyer's face tightened, but he didn't speak. Samantha, however, wasn't so quiet. "You're being stubborn, David," she said, her voice smooth but edged with annoyance. "You've got your little piece of land. You've got your business. What more do you want?" David leaned forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "What more do I want? I want what's mine. I'm not going to let you take it. I'm not going to let you take my grandfather's legacy. This ranch is not just a piece of land. It's a part of who I am." Samantha's eyes narrowed. "You think you can win this, don't you? You think you can take it all back with some moral high ground? You're delusional." David didn't flinch. "No. I'm just not going to let you take everything that matters to me. The mediator sat back, observing the tension in the room. He cleared his throat again, breaking the silence. All right, let's take a short break. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. David stood up, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. Samantha had underestimated him, and now she was about to learn that he wasn't the same man who had once been willing to give up everything. As he stepped out into the hallway, he took a deep breath, his mind already working through the next steps. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But he had something that Samantha didn't. He had the truth on his side, and that was more powerful than any settlement or money she could offer. He wasn't going to lose. Not this time. David stood in the hallway, his mind racing as he tried to process the weight of the mediation session. He had been through a lot, but today felt different. There was something about the way Samantha had looked at him, as if she still believed she could win, still believed she could control the outcome. But David wasn't the same man he had been when he first walked into this mess. He had learned to fight for himself, and he wasn't going to back down now. His lawyer walked up to him, his expression calm but serious. David, we've got a strong case here. But if we're going to take this to court, we need to be ready for everything. Samantha won't give up without a fight. David nodded, his jaw set. I know, but I'm not walking away from this. I've worked too hard for what's mine, and I'm not letting her take it. His lawyer gave him a knowing look. It's about more than just the money, isn't it? David's eyes narrowed. It's about respect. It's about showing her that she can't control me anymore. I've spent my entire life working for that ranch, for that business, and I'm not going to let her tear it apart. His lawyer sighed, clearly understanding the weight of what David was saying. We'll proceed with the mediation, but be prepared. This may get ugly. As the break ended, David walked back into the room, his mind focused. Samantha's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of determination. She clearly hadn't expected David to stand his ground this long, but now it was clear that he wasn't going to back down. The mediator took his seat, and the room fell into a tense silence. Samantha's lawyer spoke first, trying to push the settlement again. We believe this is a fair offer. We have no intention of dragging this out any longer. Let's move forward. David didn't hesitate. I'm not accepting this. Not until we address the ranch. It's mine, and it's not up for debate. Samantha's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Samantha remained silent. David could feel the shift in the room. The power dynamic had changed. For the first time, he wasn't the one being pushed around. Samantha's eyes flickered to the papers in front of her, but she didn't speak. David could tell that she knew the battle wasn't over yet. The mediator cleared his throat, sensing the tension. We'll proceed with further negotiation, he said, his voice breaking the silence. We'll set up another meeting next week. David didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what the next step would look like, but he knew one thing. He was no longer the man he had been. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. This fight was his to win, and he wasn't going to let her take anything from him. As the meeting ended and the doors closed behind him, David felt a sense of calm. It wasn't over, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had control. The next steps were uncertain, but he knew that he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Samantha had thought she could break him, but now it was clear he was the one in charge.